Imagine a facility where doctors in white coats don't heal. They dissect living prisoners without anesthesia, infect children with plague, and call it research. Hidden in the frozen plains of northeast China during World War II, Unit 731 was Japan's top secret biological warfare program, a place so horrific that survivors compared it to a factory for manufacturing death itself. For decades, almost no one outside Asia even knew its name. Records were burned, witnesses silenced, and many perpetrators went on to live comfortable, respected lives. In this video, we're pulling back the curtain on Unit 731, what it was, how it operated, what happened to its victims, and why many of its architects escaped justice. Be warned, this is one of the darkest chapters in modern history. Yet understanding it is essential if we want to recognize how ordinary people and institutions can become agents of industrial-scale cruelty. Let's step carefully inside Unit 731. To understand Unit 731, we have to place it inside a wider story. Japan's imperial expansion across Asia, the obsession with catching up to Western powers, and the warped idea that science could be weaponized to secure dominance. This was not a rogue operation hidden from Tokyo. It was a state-backed research empire directed by elite army officers and prestigious medical professionals. Over the next 15 minutes, we'll break down how Unit 731 began, who ran it, what they did to prisoners, how biological weapons were tested on civilians, and what happened when the war ended. We'll also look at why, for decades, this history was buried, especially outside China and Japan, and how it's finally being confronted today. If you're interested in deep, unflinching history like this, consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell so you don't miss future investigations. And stay with me until the end. We'll talk about why Unit 731 matters far beyond World War II. Unit 731 was born from Imperial Japan's hunger for power and fear of vulnerability. In the early 1930s, Japan had already invaded Manchuria, turning it into the puppet state of Manchukuo. The region was a laboratory for empire, far from international scrutiny and densely populated with people considered expendable by Japanese authorities. At the center of Unit 731 stood one man, General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant but ruthless army doctor obsessed with biological and chemical warfare. Inspired by reports of World War I gas attacks and aware that Western powers were experimenting with germ weapons, Ishii argued Japan had to join the race or be left behind. He sold his vision as a kind of insurance policy. If Japan mastered plague, anthrax, and cholera as weapons, enemies might be too afraid to attack. By 1936, with backing from top military leaders, Ishii secured approval to build a massive anti-epidemic research facility in occupied Manchuria. Its real mission, offensive germ warfare. The site chosen for Unit 731 was near Harbin in the Pingfong district, a place remote enough for secrecy, yet connected by rail for easy transport of supplies and prisoners. Construction began under the cover name Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. To the outside world, it sounded benign, even protective. In reality, what emerged was a sprawling complex. Laboratories, barracks, animal pens, crematoria, even a small airfield. Some estimates say the compound covered more than 6 square kilometers. High walls, guarded gates, and layers of barbed wire isolated it from nearby communities. Locals noticed strange deliveries, rail cars arriving at night, smoke rising from chimneys, but speaking openly was dangerous. Inside, architects designed specialized rooms for vivisection, pressure chambers, and freezing experiments. Drainage systems were built to flush away blood and tissue. It looked like a modern research institute, but every brick was laid to support systematic human experimentation disguised as scientific progress. To run such a facility, Ishii needed not just soldiers, but scientists and doctors willing to cross every ethical boundary. Many recruits came from Japan's top medical schools and universities. For them, Unit 731 was pitched as a prestigious posting, cutting-edge research, generous funding, and a chance to serve the empire. Ideology did the rest. Japanese propaganda portrayed Chinese, Koreans, Soviets, and others as racially inferior, almost subhuman. That dehumanization made it easier for educated professionals to label their victims not as patients, but as material. Inside Unit 731, prisoners were reportedly called maruta, meaning logs, as if they were nothing more than fuel for research. Some staff claimed later they felt uneasy at first, but were quickly absorbed into a culture of obedience and secrecy. Promotion, respect, and peer pressure all encouraged participation. Over time, many came to see their work not as murder, but as legitimate science in service of national survival, revealing how ordinary people can become perpetrators. Who were the people turned into logs inside Unit 731? Primarily Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, from farmers and laborers to resistance fighters captured by the Kwantung Army. But they weren't the only ones. Records and testimonies suggest Koreans, Mongolians, Soviets, and possibly a few Western prisoners also passed through its cells. Arrests often came without explanation. Someone suspected of supporting anti-Japanese activities could disappear overnight. Families never received official notice. They were simply told their relatives had been relocated or died of illness. In reality, they were shipped to Pingfang, stripped of identity, and assigned numbers. Conditions for prisoners were brutal. Cells were overcrowded, freezing in winter, sweltering in summer. Food was minimal, and medical care virtually non-existent, unless you were selected for an experiment. Women were subjected to sexual violence. Pregnant prisoners were deliberately infected so researchers could observe disease transmission to fetuses. Inside Unit 731, every vulnerability of the human body became potential data. Among the most notorious practices at Unit 731 were vivisections, surgical dissections performed on live prisoners without anesthesia. Doctors intentionally infected people with plague, cholera, anthrax, syphilis, and other diseases. When symptoms progressed, the victims were strapped to operating tables, and their organs were examined in real time to study how the infection spread. Witnesses described rows of metal tables, instruments laid out with clinical precision, and white-coated surgeons working methodically as prisoners screamed or lay in shock. Limbs were amputated to observe blood loss. Lungs were exposed to test gas effects. Sometimes organs were removed one by one to see how long a person could survive. To the perpetrators, anesthesia was seen as interference with pure data. These experiments weren't about curing disease. They were about weaponizing it. The logic was chillingly rational. The more they understood how germs destroyed the body, the more effectively they could deploy them on the battlefield. Cold was another weapon. In Manchuria, winters could drop to minus 30 degrees Celsius, providing a natural laboratory for frostbite experiments. Prisoners, often stripped or partially clothed, were marched outside in freezing temperatures. Their limbs were doused with water, exposed to wind and ice until skin froze solid. Researchers struck frozen limbs with sticks to listen for a wooden sound, signaling deep tissue death. Then victims were brought indoors, and different thawing methods were tested. Warm water baths, open flames, rubbing with salt or animal skins. The goal was to find the most efficient way to treat frostbite in Japanese soldiers, at any cost to the prisoners. Other experiments pushed human endurance, dehydration trials where water was withheld until death, pressure chamber tests simulating high altitude, and forced exposure to grenades and flamethrowers to study blast and burn injuries. In Unit 731, every battlefield condition was replicated, but the subjects were unarmed, bound, and completely powerless. Unit 731 didn't just study diseases, it turned entire regions into test sites. Under Ishii's direction, the unit developed plague-infested fleas, cholera bacteria, and typhoid cultures to be spread across Chinese towns and villages. Planes flew low over communities, dropping ceramic bombs packed with fleas or contaminated grain. On the ground, agents poisoned wells, released infected animals, or distributed food laced with pathogens. Outbreaks that followed were dismissed as natural epidemics, but they were anything but. Historians estimate that tens of thousands and possibly hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians died in these field trials. In one infamous operation, plague was tested in Zhejiang and Hunan provinces in 1940 and 1942, sparking uncontrolled epidemics that even threatened Japanese troops. The line between weapon and blowback blurred, but for Unit 731's leadership, this was valuable data, real-world evidence of how germ warfare could destabilize entire regions without a single traditional bomb landing. Amid this horror, the day-to-day life of many Unit 731 staff looked disturbingly ordinary. Workers lived in nearby housing, raised families, and attended social events. Children played within sight of the compound walls. Some doctors later recalled going from a morning of vivisections to an afternoon picnic as if they were simply changing tasks at a normal job. Inside the labs, routines were rigid and bureaucratic. Experiments were scheduled, results logged, reports filed up the chain of command. Promotions depended on productivity and innovative methods of killing. Scientific conferences were held where findings were presented to peers with pride, often cloaked in euphemistic language about special subjects and field results. This banality is one of the most chilling aspects of Unit 731. Atrocities weren't committed by obvious monsters in constant rage. They were often carried out by calm professionals following orders, chasing careers, and convincing themselves they were serving a higher national purpose. As Japan's war situation deteriorated in 1944-45, Unit 731 accelerated both its research and its efforts to hide evidence. There are reports that new, more desperate experiments were carried out to test last-ditch biological weapons. At the same time, Ishii and his superiors knew that if the Soviet Union or allies reached Harbin, their crimes could be exposed. In August 1945, as the Soviet Red Army advanced into Manchuria, evacuation orders were given. Documents were burned, buildings rigged with explosives, and remaining prisoners were reportedly murdered, shot, gassed, or killed with poison to eliminate witnesses. The compound was partially destroyed, though traces of its function remained. Ishii ordered staff to keep absolute silence about everything they had done. Many changed posts, returned to Japan, or blended into civilian life. When Soviet troops finally arrived, they found a devastated facility, scattered records, and the lingering stench of industrial-scale death. But the key architects were already gone. After the war, it might seem obvious that Unit 731's leaders would face trials like those at Nuremberg. Instead, what happened was far more complicated and morally troubling. The Soviet Union captured some personnel and held the Khabarovsk war crimes trials in 1949, publicly revealing details of biological warfare programs. Several defendants were sentenced to prison, though not for long. In the American-occupied zones, a different calculus emerged. U.S. intelligence quickly realized the scientific value of Unit 731's data, results from human experimentation that, however unethical, could be militarily useful. Rather than prosecute Ishii and many of his colleagues, U.S. authorities reportedly offered immunity in exchange for sharing their research. This deal remained classified for years. As a result, key figures avoided trial, some going on to prestigious careers in medicine, academia, and industry in post-war Japan. The victims' suffering was effectively traded for Cold War advantage, leaving a legacy of injustice that still scars regional politics. For decades, Unit 731 remained a shadow in public memory. In Japan, post-war narratives often emphasized victimhood, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, firebombing, while downplaying or ignoring atrocities committed in Asia. School textbooks rarely mentioned Unit 731, and survivors' stories from China and Korea were often dismissed as propaganda, yet memory persisted. In China, local residents preserved fragments of the Pingfang site. Former prisoners, forced laborers, and nearby villagers testified about strange illnesses, disappearances, and wartime rumors. From the 1980s onward, journalists, historians, and activists in both China and Japan began pushing harder for acknowledgement. Museums and memorials were established, most notably the Harbin Museum built on the ruins of Unit 731. Lawsuits were filed in Japanese courts by victims and their families, demanding apology and compensation. Some ex-members broke their silence in old age, describing their roles with a mix of remorse, defensiveness, or chilling detachment. The struggle over how to remember Unit 731 continues into the present. Unit 731 forces us to confront several hard truths. First, atrocity doesn't only emerge from chaotic battlefields. It can be planned, budgeted, and executed inside laboratories by educated professionals. Degrees and titles are no guarantee of moral restraint when ideology, nationalism, and career incentives are aligned against ethics. Second, dehumanization is a powerful tool. Once people are labeled logs, enemies, or contaminants, almost any treatment can be justified in the name of security or science. The shift from patient to specimen at Unit 731 was not just linguistic, it enabled extreme violence under the illusion of research. Third, justice is often incomplete. Many perpetrators of Unit 731 avoided real accountability, their data absorbed into Cold War programs. This reminds us that great powers sometimes prioritize strategic advantage over moral clarity. Finally, remembering matters. Museums, testimonies, and education about Unit 731 are not just about the past. They're warnings for future generations about what can happen when ethics collapses under the weight of ambition and fear. If you've stayed with this story until now, you've engaged with one of the most disturbing yet crucial chapters of 20th century history. Unit 731 isn't just a tale of evil others from a distant time. It's a case study in how systems, incentives, and ideas can turn medicine into murder and research into weaponry. So what can we do with this knowledge? We can insist that history, including its ugliest parts, be taught fully and honestly. We can support museums, scholars, and activists who preserve testimonies from survivors and witnesses, and we can remain skeptical whenever governments or institutions ask us to accept secrecy in the name of security or progress. If you found this video informative, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss future deep dives into overlooked history. Share this video with someone who's never heard of Unit 731, and let me know in the comments, what shocked you most and what lessons do you think we should carry forward?